Hi guys. Now, for our last class, I want to focus on the unseen poem and how you should approach it. So hopefully you have Daddy by Sylvia Plath. And remember, I'm just using this as an example, essentially, of the unseen poem. Okay, so it's definitely going to be a poem that you had never seen or read before. So don't forget that your first point is to focus on the context. So you may be given a little explanatory note at the very top of the poem. You may be given maybe a glossary, we'd say, the right-hand side, explaining some of the terms. So have a look at that first of all, okay? You may be given a few points relating to the poet or the context of the poem. So don't forget to read that, because sometimes that's very important. Sometimes that's vital to helping us understand the poem itself. Okay, so if I tell you that Sylvia Plath, for example, is an American poet. So she died in 1963, but she is one of the most influential, one of the most popular American poets. So in this particular poem, excuse me, she's writing about her father, Otto Plath, who was a professor and quite a stern and sort of dictatorial man. As you're reading through the poem, that becomes very apparent. When you're first looking at the title of the poem, because that will be your second port of call, so you do context first of all, explanatory notes, then you examine the title of the poem. Does that give you any clue in terms of theme perhaps, or in terms of the poet's attitude, or maybe even mood and tone as well? So the title here is Daddy. So if you think about it, that's markedly different to something like dad or da even, or father, which would be much more formal. It kind of suggests maybe we'd say the poet is a child, or the poet is writing from a child's point of view. Okay, so the word daddy sounds, we'd say, a little bit more childish than we would usually expect. Or it might suggest, we'd say, a very affectionate or warm tone. Now, that's obviously misleading when it comes to this particular poem, because as we're reading through the poem, of course, we realize that her father is a very stern and very fierce figure, that he's presented to us in violent language and terms and imagery and symbolism. So it might suggest the idea, of course, that even though Sylvia Plath is a grown woman writing this particular poem, her attitude towards her father, of course, is very subservient. It's the idea that she still feels intimidated by him. And throughout the poem, we get the sense, of course, that she felt humiliated by him as well. So it's a very complex relationship that she has with her father. And the title of the poem, of course, does actually indicate or suggest that. So remember, a lot of the time when you're reading a poem, you're reading between the lines. You're reading, of course, the surface, you're reading the lines, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, okay, this is what it means. But essentially then once you begin to think about it, you realize maybe that it means the opposite, or it means, of course, something else. So it's a little bit like your text and then your subtext. The text would just be sort of the story or the narrative in terms of a poem or a play or a film, whatever it happens to be. And then the subtext then would be the deeper meaning. Okay, so you have to take your time then when you're reading it. So I would advise you to read the poem at least twice. First of all, to get just a sense, maybe we'd say, of who features in the poem. Okay, the subject matter as such. Okay, is it a place, a person, a particular idea or a concept as such? So just to get to grips with the poem, for your first reading, and then for your second reading, then you can dig a little deeper, and you should be able to focus more on the technical aspects of the poem as you're reading through. Okay, so we're saying that our first impression obviously is of a warm and affectionate poem, okay, that is written in tribute, perhaps celebrating the poet's father. But then when we're reading through the poem, even the first verse, it's very hard hitting, and we realize, of course, that it's a much darker poem than we first anticipated or expected. So we notice how she uses repetition. We notice how she uses, of course, images related to childhood. And then we're kind of thinking about, of course, she is an adult writing this particular poem. So why does she use these sort of childish images, or why does she reference her childhood so much? If you know anything about Sylvia Plath, of course, you know that her father died when she was very young, when she was only 10, essentially. So it's reinforcing the idea then, of course, that she feels almost as if she is stuck in that particular time, so she can't move forward. And it really emphasizes then, of course, the huge influence that her father had on her as a child and is still having beyond the grave. So she addresses her father directly in the poem. You do not do any more. Black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years. Poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achew. Even the word achew sounds very childish there. Instead of saying sneeze, she literally uses the onomatopoeic word there. If we think of the image of the black shoe, there's an image of confinement and darkness there. Okay, so it's the idea, of course, that she feels hemmed in. It's a very claustrophobic image. Is she talking about the idea that she still feels as if her father is judging her from beyond the grave? She talks about live like a foot. Notice the use of the simile there, for 30 years. Poor and white, is she using that awful idiom then, the idea of poor white trash? So it's the notion here, of course, that her father is presented to us as a very oppressive and confining figure. The idea that he was domineering and dominant is introduced at the very beginning of the poem. So we realize it's not a warm and cuddly tribute anymore, that the title itself is very misleading. In the second verse, she says, Daddy, I've had to kill you. You died before I had time. And this emphasized the idea of his premature death. He actually had diabetes and had to have part of his leg amputated, and it had spread and he ended up dying as a result. Marble heavy. I mean, think of the very weighty images that she's using here as the idea of pressure or a burden that has come to bear on her. So she's really emphasizing the idea then, of course, that she feels kind of suffocated by his judgment. She feels overwhelmed when she thinks about him and she imagines him judging her, being very critical of her from beyond the grave. In terms of the childish images, of course, I mean, think of the fact that she's still calling him daddy. We had the image of achew rather than using the word sneeze. Even the image of the black shoe in which I've lived like a foot would remind you, of course, of the tale of the old woman who lived in a shoe. So there are lots of kind of images that pertain to childhood here. And the more you think about it, the more sense then is made in terms of why she's using it, because inside she still feels like a frightened little girl. She's still terrified as a result of her father's dictatorial behavior. So you died before I had time, of course. You died when I was still young. And the idea was she wasn't able to assert herself. She wasn't able to have this adult conversation with him. So a bag full of God would suggest the idea, of course, that he dominated her, that she sort of worshipped him, she adored him, that he was everything to her, and that he controlled every aspect of her life then as well. Ghastly statue. And there's all of these metaphors here comparing him to a ghastly. Ghastly means terrible, horrific. With one grey toe big as a Frisco seal. So it's the idea, it's almost like she put him on a pedestal. She sort of worshipped him. He was like a statue of a god, essentially, then. And she looked up to him quite literally. This idea is sort of a tiny little girl looking up at the plinth and then a statue. And all she can see is one little toe sort of creeping out from the edge of the plinth itself. She compares the one grey toe big as a Frisco seal, a San Francisco seal. She often went swimming. Not really in terms of the west coast of America, but the east coast of America, where she was brought up in Boston. But it's this particular idea, of course, of name checking or referencing quite a lot of what she did when she was a child. So she and her father would often go swimming. He taught her how to swim. So there's a very blatant reference there. I think the one grey toe is interesting, of course, because he had to have his foot amputated as a result of the spread of gangrene, because he didn't treat, or he didn't look for treatment for diabetes there. But it's kind of the idea of relating back the toe and the shoe then as well. So I think the idea of being stomped on, being oppressed. So once more, very dark, very sinister images. So as you're reading through, try to connect the images and try to think to yourself, why does she use that image of the shoe? Why does she use the image of the toe? What does that represent in terms of her feeling and her attitude? So she continues then with the image of the sea, and the image of the sea appears in her poetry quite a lot. And think about the sea, of course, it can represent escape and freedom, but it can also be dangerous, of course, as well. I think of the idea of drowning or floundering in the sea. So ahead in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue. I think that kind of relates back to the idea maybe of the use of colour in fairy tales and so on. A bean green would be bright green essentially. So blues and greens, of course, very natural colours. In the waters of beautiful Nauset, I used to pray to recover you. I used to want you back in my life, essentially, indicating how important he was as a father figure, but also, of course, how important his death was as well, how his death impacted her in a great sense, and the idea that she grieved for him, even though, of course, he was very domineering and suggesting here, of course, that he was abusive. Ach du, so he originally was German. So Otto Plath came over when he was 15 actually to America to seek his fortune and ended up being a professor. So ach du can be seen as kind of affectionate, oh you, of course, kind of daddy. But this kind of suggestion, of course, when she's using the German of the idea of something harsher or stricter as well, because we see that she references Nazi Germany later on in the poem as well, kind of suggesting the violent tendencies of her father. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, wars, wars. So the idea, of course, obviously of the Nazis annexing quite a number of European countries then before and during the Second World War is emphasized here. But the name of the town is common. My Polak, meaning Polish friend, says there are a dozen or two. So she's comparing herself to a town then that has been seized by the Nazis, controlled by the Nazis. So I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. So it's the idea that she felt terrified when she was a young girl to express her own opinions and ideas, especially if they were different, of course, to his opinions and ideas. She never felt like she could be herself. She never felt like she could flourish under her father's guidance, that he was very dictatorial and very stern, essentially. It's stuck in a barbed wire snare. Think about it, images relating back to the Second World War here in concentration camps. Once more images of hurt and violence and control and confinement again. Ich, ich. So the idea of kind of stammering over your words, trying to say I, but not completing the sentence. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you and the language obscene. So the idea, of course, that the language sounded very guttural and very harsh to her. An engine chuffing me off like a Jew. So using a metaphor, okay, so comparing the language then to an engine, and then chuffing me off, of course, so the idea chuff, 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 bringing the Jews to the concentration camp. Notice how she's comparing herself to a Jew, the idea of being very oppressed and downtrodden, of course, of being abused, essentially, too. A lot of people would say it's a very tasteless reference here, that perhaps it's too extreme, that she shouldn't be using examples and comparisons like that, but she's trying to emphasize how powerless and voiceless she felt as a child, how terrified, how petrified she was by her own father. So you could say that the extreme images then, of course, work very well in terms of emphasizing her feeling or her mood, of course, in the poem as well. Adieu to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen, so all the concentration camps. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. So the idea, of course, that she feels the burden of her personal history, that she feels overwhelmed then, of course, still by the memory of her father, that her father was essentially a dictator. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. So talking about the terrible history, of course, obviously of Germany during the Second World War, but referencing, of course, obviously the history of the region, perhaps Prussia, or going back before, of course, Nazi Germany as well. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck, and think about, of course, the gypsies, obviously the Romani, the travellers, essentially, as we call them in Ireland, relating back to, of course, Southern Europe, were actually persecuted by the Nazis as well. I think they said 500,000 of the Romani were actually put to death by the Nazis in the concentration camps. So she's once more identifying then with oppressed people, people who've been persecuted, essentially, and then depicting her father then, of course, as a Nazi general or even Hitler himself. My weird look and my tarot pack, and my tarot pack we'd call it a tarot pack. So think of the idea, of course, of superstition. She and her husband Ted Hughes were very fond, of course, of tarot readings, seances and things like that. So it's kind of the idea that some people are very superstitious and they believe, of course, in, we'd say, the dark arts, and they believe in magic and a kind of a supernatural sort of world, whereas other people are very logical and very rational. And she's kind of emphasizing the idea that her father maybe wasn't that creative or artistic. Her father, of course, was a professor of biology and botany, had a keen interest in bees, for example, and the study of insects and so on. Whereas she, of course, is a writer, a poet, so very different, of course, to his attitude and mindset and sort of lifestyle as well, really. So re-emphasizing, using repetition here again, my tarot pack and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. So the idea once more that she felt almost like an outsider within her own family, that she and her father essentially had very little in common. I've always been scared of you. Notice how she uses the italics there, so the slanted print to emphasize it. Nowadays, of course, we'd use capital letters for texting or sometimes writing. With your Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe, of course, would be the Air Force then during the Second World War. Your gobbledygoo, your nonsense. Is she talking about, of course, the language, the German language that she didn't really know that well, that her father more or less forced her to try and learn? Or is she talking about gobbledygoo, the nonsense that he would spout, of course? How he would try to control her, how he would try to impose his views on her. And your neat moustache, suggesting, of course, a small moustache, and that's supposed to remind you, of course, of Adolf Hitler. Your Aryan eyes, so bright blue, so the Aryan look, of course, pale skin, blue eyes, blonde hair. Panzerman, a very obvious reference then, of course, to the tanks used by the Nazis. Remember, they were pioneered, first of all, in the 1930s, of course, during the Spanish Civil War, and then came into use, obviously. They were kind of trialing them, obviously, in the First World War, and then they were using them more extensively in the Spanish Civil War, and then, of course, in the Second World War as well. So you have the Luftwaffe, of course, the planes, and then you've got the tanks, essentially, here. So using images relating back to war, kind of military images, emphasizing the idea that she feels like an oppressed victim, of course. Oh, you. No, so she's using the English here rather than the German. Not God, but a swastika so black no sky could squeak through. And the sky here, of course, if you think about it, it's just a symbol for freedom. And the swastika represents oppression because it is a symbol, of course, of Nazi Germany. Every woman adores a fascist. Think of fascist, of course, obviously brutal and violent. The boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. If you think about it, the repetition here, of course, is used for emphasis. It's very dramatic, but it's a little bit childish as well, the way she's simply repeating the same word over and over again. Is that to suggest how powerless she feels, or is it just to suggest how exasperated and frustrated and angry she feels here? That she still sees him as this brutal, violent figure. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy. So think about it. She compares him, of course, to a Nazi commandant, general, Hitler himself. She compares him now, of course, to a particularly sadistic teacher. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, and the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin. So think about, of course, a little split here in the chin. Instead of your foot, there'll be a cloven hoof. So what image is she suggesting here? She's comparing her father to the devil himself. Think of the cloven hooves of the devil. But no less a devil for that. No, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. So you realise, of course, that the poem is not just about her father. The poem is actually about her husband, who bitterly disappointed her. So she married Ted Hughes, the poet, and Ted Hughes broke her heart by having affairs with other women. In particular, of course, having an affair with a close friend of theirs, Asha Wevel, as well. So she describes him as a black man, black just here meaning sort of evil as such. And then think of bit, a very violent verb to use. The pretty red heart representing, of course, her idealised notion of love and romance. I was 10 when they buried you. So I've already informed you about that, of course, that obviously he died then when she was 10. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. And we know that Sylvia Plath attempted suicide at the age of 20. I thought even the bones would do. It's kind of the idea she was so desperate to kind of reconnect with her father. She felt so lonely and so isolated. And it really kind of emphasizes the power that he had over her. Even at the age of 20, she felt unable to move on. She desperately needed him, of course, for guidance. But they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. So think about it, that just symbolizes the idea about how she became well again. They rescued her, of course. She literally tried to kill herself by swallowing pills and climbing underneath, those wooden houses that they have in America. They're almost like on stilts, the kind of raised houses. So she climbed underneath, but she was found a couple of days later. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you. And she's kind of emphasizing how she's making the same mistakes over and over again, that she's marrying a man rather like her father, a man who was cruel, a man who was controlling, a man who broke her heart. A man in black with a Mein Kampf look, and of course that relates back to Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. And a love of the rack and the screw. Think of medieval torture implements here. And I said, I do. Now think about I do, of course, is agreeing to something, but it also represents, of course, the marriage vows as well. So as you're reading through, try to think, we say, of 2 or 3 different ideas and meanings, sort of tease it out as you're reading it through for the second time. So Daddy, I'm finally through. Interesting use of an Americanism here, because if you're through, of course, in American English, it means that you're over, it's finished, it's done, it's through. So I'm finally through. She's kind of saying, I'm finally through with you. I'm moving on with my life. I'm laying you to rest. You're no longer controlling me from beyond the grave. To be through, of course, might suggest, the idea is to be through on the phone as well, to connect on the phone. So I'm now finally, of course, expressing myself. The black telephone's off at the root, kind of cutting the connection between herself and her father. The voices just can't worm through. So think of the idea of the old-fashioned telephone line, of course, having to rely on the old-fashioned connection or lead there. I kind of think worm is an interesting word to use because it does remind you of death, of course. Think of the grave and been eaten by worms. If I've killed one man, I've killed 2. So this is the idea, of course, that her father is no longer influencing her. And now, of course, that she's separated from her husband, he no longer has control over her life either. The vampire, think of that particular image of kind of sucking your blood, draining the life from you, kind of the idea of controlling you again, of course, hurting you, harming you. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year. So notice the symbolism there, obviously using a metaphor again. 7 years, if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart. So comparing her father, of course, to the vampire as well as her husband. And one sure way, of course, of killing a vampire is to place a wooden stake, to hammer a wooden stake through the vampire's heart, essentially. And that's one way to destroy it. And the villagers never liked you. That kind of relates back to the village image that she used at the very beginning of the poem, the Polish town that was annexed by the Germans, of course, before the First World War. Second World War, I should say. They are dancing and stamping on you. That's a conventional image of dancing on somebody's grave, which means celebrating the death of someone. They always knew it was you. So remember, she's identifying with the poor villagers who were controlled then by the forces who took over the village. So she's saying, of course, I always knew it was your fault. Notice the use of italics again. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through. So think about it, she would never have dared to use language like that when she was a child, or even if he had lived, of course, for another 10 years. You can't really imagine her trying to confront him and using language like that and just being very strong and very opinionated. But finally, she's saying, of course, this is what I really think of you. So I'm through then, I'm through to you, I'm finally connecting with you, almost like a phone call. But I'm through, I'm done with this. I'm no longer going to be the victim. I'm not going to listen to the voices in my head reminding me of your thoughts and your opinions. But some people would say, of course, the last line, daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through. Is she saying I'm through with life, that I'm giving up? Is it actually a very bleak conclusion to the poem? Okay, so basically just reading through the poem, what am I focusing on? Focusing on context, the title. I'm looking at interpreting the lines, kind of connecting the images together. Okay, so what is the poet trying to communicate? Remember, it doesn't have to be very detailed or complicated, but just think about it in an intelligent way as you're reading through the poem. Okay, what is the theme of the poem? What is the poet's message or moral, essentially? Okay, then think of mood and tone. How is that conveyed? The individual words, the language, the imagery, the symbolism, the sound effects. So the style is going to be very important. You don't have to notice every single technical aspect here, but you should be able to identify the main ones. If we think of our basic comparisons, metaphors and similes, if we think of our sound effects, alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia, also remember consonants, repeated consonants rather than repeated vowels. You can also look at euphony, soft sounding language, and remember cacophony, harsh sounding language. And you could also look at something like rhyme and repetition in terms of sounds there as well. Any particular figures of speech, you notice personification, hyperbole, understatement, paradox, all of those that we've looked at before in terms of not only poetry, of course, but drama and fiction as well. So what are we looking for in terms of the unseen poem? We're looking for an intelligent reading of the unseen poem, a personal response, and showcasing your knowledge of all of the technical aspects of poetry or composing poetry as such. So once more, if you have any difficulties or queries, don't hesitate to email me. See you soon, guys. Bye.